Good morning again, everybody. And Scouts, thank you again for your leadership this morning, and we're grateful for your service to our neighborhood and our community. We're grateful for you guys, and so thankful to have you here this morning. And I know a lot of you got a very wonderfully warm welcome on your way in the doors this morning. We're grateful for that. Jay, would you put up that slide on the screen now? So on the screen, you're going to see a couple of different objects. Some of you know exactly what these are. Some of you may be wondering what they are. I'm going to tell you about it real quick. The item on the left, the black item, that is, for those of you who may not know, that is a coffee cup warmer. Anybody have one of those? Okay, a few of you. Now we know who the slow coffee drinkers are in the room. Yep, there's a couple of you have those. And then the item on the right, that is a little rubber cap that you would put over a can of a soft drink. And it would keep that can covered while you are slowly drinking it. So, when I first started drinking coffee, I got one of those because back when I was learning how to drink coffee, it would sometimes take me half an hour or 45 minutes to finish a cup of coffee. Now, on a good day, I do 3 cups of coffee in that amount of time. But back when I was learning, and that was when I was in seminary and I had a student job where I would sit by a very cold window, and I never really wanted to drink coffee until I saw it and it was hot and it was something to hold on to in between typing. And so I started drinking coffee that way, and then I would put it on one of those little warmer things. I still have one in my office, although it's currently sitting unplugged. The other one that I had something like that, it was actually far more complicated, surprisingly, as a child, where you'd go in and you'd ask Mom for if you could have a Coke or something. You'd open it up, you'd take a sip, and you'd set it on the counter and then forget about it, as children do when they are drinking something out of a can early on. And so we had something like this in our household growing up. In fact, that one had you fit it in there, you had to turn it, and even kind of screwed it tight and then clamped it closed. Never really worked very well. But the point of these two things, of course, are to preserve something that as soon as coffee is no longer hot, it is not drinkable, right? I mean, I think most of us coffee drinkers would say, I do not want room temperature coffee. Gross, dump it out, start over. Or microwave it and keep going. But warm coffee, it has to be hot. Warm is, room temperature is terrible. And then there's the iced coffee thing, but we're not talking about that. Then there's the stopper that goes over a can of a soda. For those who can't finish a drink of 12 ounces in one sitting, this is for you. And you can use this, but you all know that as soon as the carbonation is gone and the drink is flat, gross, nobody wants it. Jesus talked about something very similar, an analog for his time, where he talked about salt. You heard Thatcher read that scripture just a few moments ago. You are the salt of the earth, but salt that has lost its taste is worthless and then can be trampled underfoot. I don't really worry about salt losing its taste. That is not something that I have encountered, but apparently in Jesus' day, I think that was like a flat soft drink or room temperature coffee. The idea is that it is not the thing that it once was. Is it still the thing? Yes. Is it still salt? Yes. Is flat Coke still Coke? Yes. Is room temperature coffee still coffee? Technically. Does anybody want it? Absolutely not. No. And so Jesus is talking about salt in this manner, and he's using something as he is trying to sit down with the disciples and those who are listening. He's trying to explain to them what their role is to be. So why would we talk about that? It seems like an interesting transition. Let's take a step back and look once again at the context of this passage. Last week, we started with the beginning of the 5th chapter of Matthew. And I explained to you that what Matthew, as a gospel writer, is trying to do is he is trying to draw some parallels between Moses, a great leader of the Jewish faith, and now Jesus, the newest leader of the Jewish faith in his time. right? And so he says that these two men, they have similar stories. They both sought refuge in a foreign land. They were both fleeing persecution. They both come out of Egypt. They both go for a period of time into the wilderness where they endure trials and challenges, and it's a formative experience for them. And then they emerge, and Moses goes up onto Sinai, onto the mountaintop. He receives the law and the commandments from God, and he comes down and he teaches the people about God's direction and will for their lives. And Jesus goes up onto an unnamed mountain, now known as the Mount of the Beatitudes, which is, by the way, pictured on your bulletin cover. He goes up onto that hillside, onto that small mountain, and he communicates, not a message from God being relayed through him, but he speaks with the authority of God as God's Son to share this message. And so, again, if you are hearing this story and you are connecting the dots between the authority that Moses has and now that authority resting on Jesus, the first thing out of Jesus' mouth is going to be very important. What is he going to say? He's having this mountaintop Moses-like experience. What is going to be the first thing out of his mouth? And so he shares what we have come to know as the Sermon on the Mount. He begins with the series of blessings called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who will be persecuted, and so forth. Right? We covered those last week. He finishes this series of blessings, and then he pivots into this next part, which is today's lesson, picking up immediately after last week's. He says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its taste, its saltiness, it's no longer useful. You are the light of the world. You are like a city on a hill." And then he says, just like the salt losing its salinity, he says, and if you have a light and you put it under a cover or you take it off the lampstand, what's the point? It doesn't cease to be light at that point, but it does cease to be useful. So we've heard this, probably if you were raised in the Christian tradition and you have grown up in the church, you've probably heard this many, many times over. But what exactly is Jesus talking about here? We're adults. We get the metaphor. Okay, clear. But so what? And why this? Why now? Why following the Beatitudes? Why is this something that needs to be said as part of Jesus' sort of coming out sermon? Why? The timing seems odd. Part of what we talked about last week, we got into a little bit, and again, we'll reiterate again this week, is that Jesus is sharing this message at a really interesting and kind of pivotal time period in the Hebrew people, the Jewish people's history. As you know from the Old Testament, there have been any number of back and forths where there was an outside invading force that came in, they took control, life was very hard, the people were oppressed, and God faithfully led them through that experience. The prophets came, they shared an ideal about how they should live their lives and how they should work for justice. The text that's often paired with the Beatitudes is, as I think referenced last week, Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to seek justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? These are the ideas that when the people begin to start practicing these things again, the fog clears and the circumstances begin to change a little bit because God's message for God's people perseveres even through the hardship in the most difficult eras and stages of time. So now we're in a different kind of time period. We hear the tension all the time with first century Palestine and the challenges that those people, the people that are around Jesus and his community, they're facing the challenges of living under Roman occupation. Rome, you remember, is this massive force. They are as big of a force as the world had ever seen at that time. They take over parts of the ancient Near East. They take over parts of Europe and Northern Africa. And so they are all about controlling the entirety of their kingdom. And so Jesus is preaching at a time where there is constant pushback. There's oppression based on the things that can be practiced, the things that can be said, the communication and how it's shared, about oppressive taxation, all of those things. And Jesus is preaching a message at this point, not just to the people who have gathered by his side, but to those who might hear and heed a warning. The challenge in Jesus' time, and the challenge that would continue at the time that Matthew is writing this gospel, about 40 years later, is that the religious leaders, the institution of the Jewish faith at this time and place, has become more and more comfortable with the Roman leadership and the occupation. In other words, the sacred and the secular are becoming more and more intermeshed, entwined together. For example, you may remember that there are references to throughout the Gospels about the high priests. When Jesus is put on trial, he ends up going to the house of the high priest. And his name at that time is Caiaphas. Caiaphas and the other high priests during Jesus' time were not chosen and elected by the Jewish leadership. They were selected by Rome. So it's interesting then that this thing of Judaism, the faith tradition, has sought to remain separate from the state, and yet at the time that Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, the state is determining who is leading the faith tradition. And what Jesus is pointing out, and what Matthew is eager to reiterate in Jesus' teaching, is he says, beware of what happens when the religion that you practice gets a little too comfortable with the powers that be, and when it becomes difficult to differentiate between the state's ideal and the faith tradition's ideal. So Jesus is preaching something that is a message about humanity, but by merely sharing it, he is saying something that others will see is overtly political. So Jesus is saying, look, if there's ever a time where your faith and your nationalism become intermixed together, where they are in the same bed, then this is problematic. And he's saying, in essence, you as people of faith, you as people of the covenant, you as people who have received God's blessing and authority and grace on your life have an obligation to share that with the world and to live your life accordingly. But if you dilute that power, if you become too complacent about your faith, then it's like salt that has lost its saltiness. It is like coffee that has turned room temperature. It is like a soft drink that has lost all of its fizz. In other words, you've become diluted to the point that you are talking loud and saying nothing. And this is the thing that Jesus is warning about. You have the capacity to be salt. You have the capacity to be like a light, a beacon on a hill, guiding people to grace and truth and mercy and love. But if you instead hinder that, if you don't emphasize that, but you suppress that, then what good is that at all? So this message comes through loud and clear because after Jesus' death and resurrection, and after the early church is getting started, now this message isn't just for the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time, but now it's for the early church leaders. Tragically, even as the church is starting to gain momentum and it's like going like gangbusters and it's spreading throughout the ancient Near East and it's going into Asia Minor and it's going into Europe and it's going into North Africa and all of this stuff is happening and everything is going great, but already we're seeing that this problem is starting to happen. And the problem is that people who are generally well off and comfortable with life say, I don't really need to sort of go all in on the faith because I am doing all right. And the message is still the same. And so Matthew is eager to share this message with the early church as well. Hey, look, guys, it's pretty easy to go from those who are poor in spirit, but when the circumstances change, and you're the ones in control, you are the ones with the power, you are the ones with the wealth, it's pretty easy to become complacent. It's pretty easy to become room temperature coffee. We even see this in another early church in Asia Minor. You know, the Bible ends with the book of Revelation, and in the 3rd chapter of Revelation, there are these critiques about these different early church communities that are just getting a foothold in their area. And these churches are critiqued for different reasons, but the one called Laodicea is critiqued because this is a church that is in a relatively prosperous place. This is a community of people who, things seem to be going pretty well, and they have received this message about the grace of Jesus, and they are eager to be practitioners of the faith tradition. But because life is okay and they're relatively comfortable, they sort of begin to turn a blind eye on those who are in need. And they say, as long as my needs are taken care of, I don't really have to be as consumed and concerned about my neighbor's well-being. And Jesus, it says in Revelation, says, woe to you, the church in Laodicea, because you have become lukewarm. You are not hot, you are not cold. And so then rather graphically it says, and so I choose to spit you out, because what good is that? So this isn't just a Jewish leadership problem in Jesus' time. It isn't just a problem in Matthew's community, and it isn't just a problem in Laodicea. We see this, and the reason that this text continues to speak with resonance and importance and relevance into our lives is because this is a problem that we continue to see. We have seen the dangerous impact of what happens when the church becomes too blasé about its mission. And we have seen what happens when the line is blurred between the church and the state, and there is no accountability anymore, and no one is there to speak up and voice the concerns for those who are powerless, who are suffering, who are disenfranchised. And my fear, and I know that you share this fear with me, is that over the past 10, 20 years, I feel like we are in another one of those movements in the church. I feel like we are very much at risk for turning a blind eye to the concerns around us because it's easy to get a little bit too comfortable. As long as life is okay for you and me, it's inconvenient to look upon the needs of those who are suffering. And we get bombarded with it. And it's constantly in the news, and it's constantly in our social media, and it's constantly in our face, and so we get tired of it. And you get that, we hear about compassion fatigue. And yet, compassion fatigue sure sounds a lot like losing your salinity, taking that light off the lampstand and suppressing its glow. And we see things that we just continue to find more and more challenges with the social systems that are in place. And God, I mean, we see things that are deeply concerning, don't we? The likelihood of political violence becoming more and more of a daily occurrence. We see more and more demonization of those who have a different perspective from our own. We get overwhelmed and say, well, I guess I don't know what I can do about it, so I throw my hands up in the air and say I'm exhausted by the whole thing. We see little bits of racism or even strong cases of racism continue to creep up around us, and it becomes more and more acceptable to say horrific things, right? These are things that we have a moral and faith-filled obligation to speak out about. These are things that cannot be acceptable, or else we are falling right back into the same trap that Jesus warned against with his very first sermon. Jesus has the incredible ability to preach a message to us that lasts tragically from one generation to the next, because we are not immune from fighting some of these same challenges that the early church fought, that the ancient Jewish leadership fought, that Christianity throughout the centuries has had to address. And this is our turn to speak with a bold and prophetic witness about what we are called to do. And when we ask ourselves, what is it that we should be doing? How will we know if we are doing enough? What are we supposed to do as people of faith when we find the situations around us and the world changing at this rapid pace? What is our response for that? And I would say, while there is no easy solution, quitting is not an option. Throwing our hands up in exasperation is not an acceptable choice. So what do we do? I think that we go back to the beginning of the sermon. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. How are we addressing and responding to the needs of the poor around us? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. When it says blessed are those who mourn, it's not talking only about those who are grieving the death of a loved one. It is talking about those who grieve justice not being executed. It is about those who desire for something more and know that we are called to build a kingdom that is greater than the one that we currently live in, but are finding themselves frustrated, dissatisfied, angry, and hurting in the process. We mourn, for we do not experience the world as it is intended to be. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Who are the meek around us? How can we support them? How are we lifting them up? How are we doing what we are called to do with humility? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Are we coming to the side of and lending our voice to those who are working to fight oppression? Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Why is it that mercy sometimes seems like such a weakness in the world around us? Why are those who are merciful seen as less than, when in fact those are the ones we should be lifting up their example? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Are we, in fact, on the lookout for those people? Are we trying to be those people? This is the litmus test for us, friends. Are we trying to live out and support the Beatitudes, or are we losing our solemnity? I believe that Christ calls us in this very first sermon that he preaches. He gives us the blueprint for how to respond as the church. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean that it's a quick fix, but it certainly doesn't mean that we give up. This is not the era where the church struggles and takes a back seat to the culture. In fact, it should be the opposite. We are the voice that should be lending a moral authority about how to go forward. We are the voices that say grace, peace, reconciliation, care for your neighbor, loving for those who are suffering, lifting up the persecuted. These are the priorities of the church, and we will bear faithful witness to what Jesus calls us to do when we honor these words. And we will show by our example what it means to be a city on a hill. If those who look on from the outside and say that the church is full of empty promises and shallow words, then they have an argument to be made as long as we continue to be more and more indifferent to the struggles and the suffering around us. But we have the opportunity to be a city on a hill. We have the opportunity to be salt that has not lost its taste. We have the opportunity to be disciples again in 2026 just as the disciples of Laodicea and Matthew's community and those who gathered on the hillside with Jesus for his very first sermon. That is our charge. That is our calling. Let us go and do this thing which Jesus has compelled us to do. Let's pray.